Did you know that the legacy and horrors of slavery go beyond the well-known image of white male slave owners? Prepare for a shocking revelation as we dive into a dark and lesser-known chapter of history by exposing the untold cruelties of white and black female slave owners. From the inhumane treatment of slaves by their white female owners to the often overlooked black-to-black subjugation, we'll uncover the haunting realities of their actions and shed light on the complexities of power, race, and gender during this dark period of history. Get ready to be enlightened as we expose these uncomfortable truths that have been long ignored but are vital for our collective growth and progress. During the time of slavery, it was impossible to discuss the topic without acknowledging the role of female slave owners and their cruel actions. Many women owned slaves and actively participated in the buying and selling of enslaved individuals. White women, in particular, played a significant and violent role in the slave market. They not only bought, sold, and managed slaves, but also worked hard to secure the return of those who had escaped, as they had a strong economic interest in them. Interestingly, owning a large number of enslaved people actually increased a woman's desirability as a potential marriage partner. This led to some white women striving to possess more slaves, as it would improve their chances of finding a suitable husband. Once married, these women didn't relinquish their control over the slaves. In fact, they often fought legal battles in court to maintain their ownership rights over enslaved individuals, rather than surrendering them to their husband's ownership. Surprisingly, they frequently emerged victorious from these disputes. However, it's important to note that their exposure to the slave market didn't begin in adulthood. It started within the confines of their own homes when they were little girls, where they witnessed the buying and selling of human beings firsthand. This early exposure shaped their understanding and participation in the slave market as they grew older. In those days of slavery, the cruelty of white mistresses unveils shocking and distressing stories, shedding light on the involvement of even infants in the ownership and mistreatment of enslaved people. It may be difficult to believe, but there were instances where infants were given enslaved individuals as gifts. One particularly disturbing account revolves around a training program for white children in plantation management, where the children, irrespective of their age, were taught through the brutal beating of enslaved individuals. As these children grew into adults, the cruel behavior persisted. White women would heartlessly separate black women from their own babies to ensure they could nurse the white mistress's child instead. In order to facilitate this practice, thousands of advertisements were placed in newspapers by white women, seeking enslaved wet nurses who had recently given birth. This created a thriving market for enslaved black women who were forced to serve as wet nurses, nourishing the children of their white oppressors instead of their own. It's deeply disturbing to also learn about how formerly enslaved individuals shared experiences of mistresses condoning sexual violence by white men or orchestrating violence among owned slaves to produce children, as all these vile acts were meant to fulfill the mistress's twisted desires. Even during the Civil War, white women vigorously fought to protect their wealth and the access to free labor that slavery offered them. As Union troops moved through the South, freeing enslaved individuals, white women resorted to desperate actions to retain control. They relocated their enslaved individuals to distant places, hoping to keep them enslaved for a longer period of time, away from the soldiers' reach. One notable and shocking case is that of Martha Gibbs, who went to great extremes to exert control over enslaved individuals. She forcefully transported them to Texas and, using the threat of violence with a gun, compelled them to work for her until 1866, even though slavery had officially been abolished a year earlier. Even after the Civil War, white women in the South sought to reinstate a form of slavery through unjust work contracts. Their goal was to retain power over formerly enslaved individuals and exploit their labor. In addition to these actions, some white women wrote books that portrayed slavery as a gentle and harmless institution. A notable example is Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, despite her being born many years after slavery had been abolished. Although the documentation of black female slave owners' cruelty may not be as comprehensive as as that of their white counterparts, it is crucial to acknowledge that instances of black women owning slaves did occur during the era of American slavery. In some cases, black women became slave owners through inheritance. They would receive enslaved individuals as part of an inheritance from family members, including husbands or fathers who were themselves slave owners. In other cases, black women obtained slaves through various means, including purchasing or trading. The reasons behind black women owning slaves were diverse. Some aimed to safeguard their loved ones and ensure their freedom by owning slaves, using ownership as a means to protect their families from the harsh realities of slavery, such as the risk of being sold or separated. For some individuals, owning slaves offered a chance for economic progress and social standing within a society deeply rooted in slavery. Many of these black women embraced the narrative dominated by white culture and aspired to imitate their behavior in order to gain acceptance or security. Moreover, slave ownership provided economic benefits since slaves could be utilized as plantation laborers or domestic servants. In addition, black female slave owners used their position to assert dominance over enslaved individuals by exhibiting behavior similar to white male slave owners. They enforced strict rules, withheld education, and promoted a culture of fear to suppress resistance and ensure compliance. By participating in the system, these women perpetuated a hierarchy that ultimately undermined the freedom and well-being of their fellow black community members. One remarkable example of a black female slave owner is Marie Therese Coin Metoyer. She was born into slavery in the late 18th century, but eventually gained her freedom and became a successful businesswoman and landowner in Louisiana. Coin acquired and owned several enslaved individuals, including members of her own family. Her story highlights the complexities and contradictions surrounding race, power, and ownership during that time. As we continue to examine the history of white and black female slave ownership, it becomes evident that acts of cruelty were regrettably common. There are documented instances where enslaved individuals were coerced by their female owners to engage in sexual acts with strangers, often in exchange for monetary gain. These exploitative practices underscore the oppressive nature of slavery and highlight the power imbalances within this institution. It's simply disheartening to acknowledge that some female slave owners actively participated in the exploitation and degradation of the individuals they held in bondage. Enslaved women were often burdened with demanding tasks and faced severe repercussions if they failed to complete them within strict time limits. These distressing accounts offer a glimpse into the immense cruelty and exploitation that certain female slave owners inflicted upon the enslaved population. They would employ physical violence, forcing enslaved individuals to endure grueling working conditions and administering severe punishments. Instruments like whips, chains, and confinement were used to enforce discipline and inflict pain. Regrettably, female slave owners were not exempt from the heart-wrenching practice of selling or separating enslaved families. Their involvement in such actions inflicted immeasurable emotional distress and lasting trauma upon the enslaved individuals affected. In a document published in 1681, clergyman Morgan Godwin, who served in Virginia and Barbados, described a disturbing incident of public punishment. He witnessed the merciless flogging of an enslaved woman by her mistress. What troubled Godwin even more was the presence of an English woman, referred to as a mistress, among the onlookers. According to Godwin, she shamelessly stood alongside the men and boys, showing no signs of embarrassment. She coldly watched as the bondswoman, with her upper body exposed, endured repeated lashings. Other means female slave owners also exercised control and dominance over the enslaved individuals was by imposing strict regulations, closely monitoring their every move, and subjecting them to dehumanizing treatment. Basic human rights like education, proper healthcare, and autonomy over one's body and personal life were often denied to the enslaved population under their ownership. But despite the presence of these cruel conducts, it's important to recognize that the experiences of enslaved people were diverse, and not all female slave owners were equally harsh. Some showed a certain level of compassion and treated their enslaved individuals with relatively less severity. severity, acknowledging their humanity to some extent. However, we should know that slavery itself is inherently brutal and dehumanizing, regardless of the gender of the slave owner. Therefore, approaching the topic of slavery and the cruelty inflicted by female slave owners demands sensitivity and empathy. We must acknowledge the profound suffering endured by enslaved people and the lasting impact it had on their lives and subsequent generations. When we recognize and understand this painful history, we can work towards a more just and equitable future. Now tell us, have you come across any first-hand accounts of the cruelty by white and black slave owners that were not mentioned in this video? Let us know in the comments section below. Also, feel free to explore other interesting videos displayed on your screen while you're still here. See you there!